Hello and hi, everybody. Welcome to this discussion about world building in comics hosted by the Columbus Cartoon Coalition in collaboration with the Global Comic Project. I am your host, Kelci D, also known as Kelci D Comics on YouTube. I am joined by...
Hi, I'm Ben Wright Human, cartoonist extraordinaire. You can find me BWH Comics pretty much everywhere.
And...
I'm Ian Klesch, writer creator, and I'm surprisingly hard to find, honestly. Mostly in print.
Yes, including in some anthologies that all three of us are a part of, like Less Than Secret Encrypted Anthology and What the Gnomes Know.
So, and soon to be coming out robot anthology that we hopefully will have a name for before too long.
Knock on wood. All right, so we're here to discuss world building in comics. World building can cover a lot of facets. It can cover writing and art and a whole bunch of other things. But before we get into the list of questions that I have here, I figured the first question we should ask is, what is world building? I mean, I touched on it a little bit where it's like you can make art and you can make writing about it. But what is it exactly? What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of world building? Let's start with Ben.
For me, world building is the homework. It's the pre-work you got to do before you're going to tell a story to figure out what the setting is going to even look like. And sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes you've got a story already. You just need something that'll fill in the spaces. Other times it could get very specific. You could be creating a world from whole cloth, or you could be telling a story in a setting that already exists or a setting that actually happened. And a big part of the world building there is getting your facts right, getting your information straight and consistent, and figuring out the rules.
Cool. Ian, what are your thoughts?
So I agree with all that was said, right? It's the designing the rules and the if you were to drop a character into that world, how are they going to interact with it, right? Mm-hmm. What can they or can't they do? What are the like I said, the general rules of it? What is allowed to happen? Is it fantasy? Is it sci-fi? Is it can they utilize magic? Can they utilize anything that's outside of your actual current understanding of physics if it's based in a certain point in time within our history, like what's available to them? Mm-hmm. And are you doing some sort of revisionist history to that, right? So it's designing all of the different, for lack of a better way of putting it, rules, I guess.
Yeah. So it's basically like coming up with like a rule set for a story to operate in would be probably a fair assessment to say.
Yeah. Now, granted, that's from a writer perspective. Obviously, from a artist, it also involves all the look of it, right? And some of that comes through the writing as well, right? Sometimes that's incredibly important to the story itself.
Yeah.
But from a writer's perspective, a big part of it is just deciding like what can you do. So.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking as an interesting illustrative example in terms of like writing and keeping the rules consistent, I'm just thinking about the world building of How to Train Your Dragon and the fact that all of the adults have Scottish accents and all of the young people speak in like late 2000s, early 2010s kind of pop lingo. Which is interesting to me and is an interesting world building choice. I'm not saying that it's good or bad. Definitely not saying that it's bad, but I do think that it is an interesting world building choice. But that's one set of rules that exists. And I feel like with world building, it's not just, oh, this is the magic system that you build, or, oh, this is the world economy that the people are operating in. It's also thinking about what language are they using to describe things? Like the world building of 1984, like George Orwell's 1984, is very different from the world building of a lot of other dystopias because Orwell focuses so much on language and how it's used, as an example. And there are other worlds where language is part of the world building. Like I've heard that Patrick Rothfuss's novels focus a lot on the power of names, and there are some novels of Ursula K. Le Guin that also focus on that. So, it's not just like language or pretty pictures; it's also how it's used. And we can get into the visual aspects later. But I wanted to ask, what's the first question that you ask yourself before you start making a world? This time we'll go back to Ian.
So for me, it comes down to, do I already have a story or do I have a world in mind? So if I've got a story, I start fleshing out of, okay, if I need these characters to interact with it in this way, what am I having to flesh out around them for them to be able to function in that? So a good example, I'm working on one right now where it is taking place in a fantasy setting. And I had the idea for, literally, I had an interaction between two characters, and it involves a giant and a certain rules for them. And I had to decide, like, okay, so what exists around them then? For this to even take place, what has to happen? So fleshing out, is this high fantasy? Is this my own world itself? Is this fantasy rules within futuristic settings, right? Is there magic and electricity and all that fun stuff? And so sort of starting from there, I had to flesh out, okay, if this is where I'm starting, was with these two characters, what would sit around them? What seems fitting with that? Other times where I've had an idea for, I literally had a world that I thought would be really fun to play in, and I thought, great, now I have to find a story. So what comes from there? So I think it truly depends on what inspires you to create that world. Is it characters? Is it setting? Is it? And when I say like a world building for the one that I had the setting, it literally came from, I had a neat idea for an actual planet setup, and like, if it was built in this way, what would that mean for different cultures there? And then how would you interact with those? And so branching out from there. So I think you can start from anywhere. It just comes down to what inspires you to even create it in the first place.
Yeah. It can also kind of plug into characters and how you create characters, right? I'm thinking of the example of Travis Willingham from Critical Role gave the example of a character that he created for a miniseries where he said, oh, I got this idea for this character from a set of gauntlets that I picked up from a costume shop. And by looking at those gauntlets, I figured out that it was a part of this kind of a combat set. And when I looked into that, it was like, oh, it's based on like a Filipino martial arts style. And then I looked into that, found out about Filipino hawks, and then it was just like a spiral from there. And it's fascinating to think about that, not just from like a character building standpoint, but also from a world building standpoint. So that was the first example I thought of when you were going into that. Ben, what is the first question you ask yourself before you start making a world?
It's funny because I very rarely go into anything with the intention of making a world, but as soon as I get an idea for a world, it starts happening. Like I usually don't do it deliberately. I just, every once in a while, I'll be like, I usually start with a concept and just have an idea. I'm like, hey, it would be cool. And then all of a sudden that starts spiraling out of control and becoming a lot bigger. I'll give an example. This is a really old backburnered project of mine called Roulette. Ian knows about this one.
You know this one.
This basically started with the concept of, what if luck were a tangible, measurable force that people kind of understood. And like people could have luck or good luck, bad luck, anywhere on that spectrum. And from there, I started creating an entire sci-fi setting. I had moon where that was off of the planet that everything was, that this element that affected luck was harvested from. And this moon had a city that was basically a gigantic Las Vegas, because of course you would have right near the whole this place where you could farm an element that increased the effect of luck. So of course you have a casino town nearby. And then you have huge, massive social stratification based on if you're lucky or not lucky. And then I created like mythology and like characters that had special items that would make them have no luck whatsoever, be completely neutral. So they had to be skilled instead of relying on on the one thing that makes everything else in the world run.
Mhm.
And it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and spiraling more. It's honestly a cool setting. It needs some massive rewrites, but
Yeah.
that just started from one idea and just kept
Mhm.
getting bigger.
Yeah.
It's not unlike how I make D&D worlds too.
It was a fun
That's
world
fair.
to play in too. I know you and I used to discuss that back in the day, and it was always fun
Yeah.
to talk through. Okay, well, what about this? And I would start to pull it apart for you, like, okay, well, what about this and what this? Like, well, actually this. So, and I think sometimes that's helpful, right? To have somebody else poke holes in it to see what had you
Mhm.
not yet fleshed out, and like, I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and also it's helpful to reach out to people for parts of the world building that you're like, I don't give that much about this, but I know this other person who's really into that kind of stuff. Like anytime that there's any kind of like politics, I got to reach out to somebody else because I don't care that much about building political structures in my worlds to an extent. But to answer the question, the first question that I ask myself before I start making world, it's actually more about looking at already pre-existing thing and asking myself an alternative question. I brought this up in a previous chat here in the Columbus Cartoon Coalition when we were talking about making characters. And you can watch that video by looking at our YouTube channel, self-plug. But I do this with world building too, where I was actually inspired to make the Legend of Jamie Roberts when I was studying African art history, and I learned about a particular mask in West African society. I don't remember which society it was specifically, but it was somewhere around Benin or Burkina Faso, somewhere in that region. They had a particular mask called Warakun, and it looked like a dragon head. And it was fabled to breathe fire, but it could only be worn by particular members of the society. It was a witch hunter's mask. And I saw that and I went, what if there was a world where dragons were witch hunters? And I used that as the world building impetus for the Legend of Jamie Roberts. And it's like, well, if dragons were witch hunters, then they would have a high status in society and they would be the leaders of a sort because they know how to banish the dark entities that would otherwise threaten humanity and that sort of thing. And it just rocketed from there. So that is to say, though, that while there are some like real world draws that go into the Legend of Jamie Roberts, like there are actually locations in Chapter 10 in particular that are inspired by Canyon de Chelly, which is in Navajo Nation, an actual like place, which is really cool. If you ever get a chance to go, definitely go there. The cliffs are like 1,000 feet deep though, so hike at your own risk. But yeah, it's still really cool. Highly recommend that you check it out. But that is to say, I mean, toe carefully if you're gonna be looking at real world inspirations. Try not to pull up Picasso, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it is useful though. Like Chris Perkins, who's one of the main designers behind modern Dungeons and Dragons, has talked before about the fact that he doesn't like reading fantasy novels. When he's looking for inspiration, he goes to history books. He finds that much more useful for storytelling and for all of that. And that is also one of the places where, honestly, a lot of weight tends to go on artist more than writer for a lot of this, because especially if you're using any kind of real world historical situation, there is a lot of research you got to do on that in order to get it right. And there is a degree with some stuff where you can fudge it for the sake of fiction, but at the same time, you want to be careful because it's really easy to get things wrong in offensive ways or even just ruin the immersion of it. Like if you're doing an Old West story and a ray gun shows up, that could be an issue unless you've established that there is like Doc Brown showing up or something.
Right. Yeah. I did see in the private chat, Ian, what was it that you wanted to ask?
So you just mentioned, someone who wants to avoid certain types of books and they're looking for their inspiration when you're world building. So I think I'm I've heard from other people that they don't operate the same way, and I'm wondering where you two sort of fall on this. When I am still in the early stages of trying to flesh it out and find out what does this world look like, I purposely avoid other media that seems similar because I don't want to necessarily have influences. I want to make sure that I'm creating something that seems newish, and then when I go into it, I can say, okay, go back afterwards to see, like, are there any things that are clearly broken with this process afterwards? But I try to keep it mostly untainted, because when I did it before, you're like, oh, that's neat, I'll pull that. You're like, this is mostly an already created thing. So I wasn't sure where you two fall on that as far as when you're creating. Do you dive into looking for inspiration from other fiction, or are you mostly trying to keep away from that at first?
Ben, do you want to go, or is it okay if I go first?
I do have an answer. I'm the exact opposite.
Go for it.
Well, the big thing for me is because I have this problem all the time of parallel thinking. I'll give an example. I'm actually working on a series right now that is going to be it's going to be a D&D and Bubblegum Shoe crossover. Bubblegum Shoe is a great mystery system, by the way. But
I've been meaning to check that out.
It's so good. But one of the things that was tricky with it is a lot of it has to do with dreams and stuff like that. And I've been debating working in elements of A Midsummer Night's Dream and throwing some of my English and drama major weight around. And then I watched The Unsleeping City, and it did a lot of the stuff I was already going to do. And that made me go, okay, this is something I'm making for the general public. I need to pivot because someone else has done this idea already. For me, if you don't know what ideas are out there, you don't know if you're copying somebody. It's not even copying somebody else. It doesn't, because there is parallel thinking. You don't know if you're doing something that has already been covered. You also,
which is fair,
absolutely, if you're careful about it, can steal. Like, there are elements to that. I mean, you're not necessarily going to want to do the exact same thing as somebody else, but you'll absolutely find elements to be like, that's cool. I wonder if I could take this in a different direction.
Yeah.
True. I mean, how many times have we seen doing the story, right? And in different media.
Yeah.
Like just retold multiple times, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It depends for me on what the project is. I do actually check out stories within a similar genre that the world would be in, but not necessarily to be like, oh, did they already cover this topic? Because I'm not too concerned about that necessarily. I'm in the Neil Gaiman camp of things when it's like, because he answered this question for a young creative person who was like, I'm afraid of creating something derivative. How do I make something original? And Neil Gaiman was like, you're already doing something original. You're telling something from your own perspective. Like the world, you might think that the world has enough, like, storytellers or songwriters or comic creators, or his throwaway joke in that was politicians. Well, no, the world has enough politicians, but the world only has one you. And that's how I approach it. With that regard, is there is only one me, and I am a unique collection of perspectives. And Ben is a unique collection of perspectives. Ian is a unique collection of perspectives. And that is something that should be owned and celebrated. But when it comes for me, for like the sorts of things that I look at when I'm looking at and building a world, I actually look at a lot of nonfiction books that cover the topics that I'm looking at. Like there is a sci-fi story that I've had in the works for a while, but it has a highly segregated society. So I've been reading a lot of books like Caste, like White Fragility, like a whole bunch of other, like realistically social justice books, and looking at those and at history books to look at what segregated societies looked like, why they were segregated the way that they were, how that played out, and the way that that would shape the societies, and pulling that in for that book. for the world building for the Legend of Jamie Roberts, a lot of that world building was actually done in college when I was in college. Like, it was a lot of African art history. I took enough courses in it that I almost considered putting it on my degree, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through for that. But I had studied enough of it that it was like, oh, I could almost get accredited for this. There was also like field studies that I did in Navajo Nation. I took some Native American lit classes and learned some things about Native American literature and how that's different from most mainstream literature. And that also went into the Legend of Jamie Roberts a little bit, more than a little bit. But yeah, I tend to turn towards nonfiction a lot when it comes to world building, especially as like jumping off points and making myself ask questions. Like, I also did a lot of Native American history research for the Legend of Jamie Roberts and found out a lot of fascinating things about alliances between groups and how that was done. So that also went into the story a bit. And that's generally how I do it, is I just I ask myself questions and then I look at other research. But this does lead to the next question that I want to ask. This is actually from J.M. Hunter, who was supposed to be one of our co-hosts, but he ended up having to bow out because he's sick. We're sending you good vibes, JM. We hope you're feeling better soon. But he wanted to ask.
Stuck with me.
Yeah, we're stuck with Ben. Gosh dang it. Yeah, it's a big shrug. But JM wanted to ask us, when is it time to pause world building and start walking in it? Many people sit and wait until it's perfect or so ambitiously epic that it overwhelms them. So, Ben, we'll start with you. When is it time to like start walking around and actually like doing a story within the world? Or
I'm so tempted to lean into my mic and scream. But instead I will say, from a respectful distance, but very clearly, perfect does not exist. Get in the mud.
Yeah.
Get in there.
Yeah.
Do it now.
Roll around in the mud. Roll around in it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, like, if you're on the outside building stuff, you're never going to really know what it's like in there. Yeah. Going back to, because I'm going to use Dungeons and Dragons as a reference for a lot of stuff, because that's where a lot of my world building energy goes. That does lead to comics. I had a comic based on D&D recently called Family Business.
Yeah. But hey, there is a lot of world building that goes into particularly homebrewed Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, or even like official books. If you don't like some of the official rules and you're like, I'm going to do it differently.
And I'll tell you, the biggest thing that does world building is when you're actually playing the game. I've had a setting that I've been building since college, and I started a campaign in it a while ago, and it was one of those things where I'd had all these ideas and I'd put them down, but until you're actually in there playing characters in that world, until you have players who are asking questions you didn't think of, which is another place where collaboration comes in great. You don't know what needs to be expanded. We had a character who ended up being elven nobility, and I'm like, well, now I need to know how the elven hierarchy works. Like, I put one throwaway line, and now I'm stuck with it. And it's like, I want to be involved in that. I'm like, okay, now I need to figure all this out. There's actually a really funny example that came up recently. I was putting together a document of all the stuff I'd come up with for this, because I'm going to be starting a new campaign in that setting that Ian's going to be in, by the way.
Very exciting.
But like, there's this, like, here's one random throwaway thing I came across. I'd established that there was this old cataclysm, and the way dragons survived the cataclysm, because it's D&D, you got to have dragons, is they basically created a pocket dimension and went into it, and it became known as the Draconic Plane. And I had this moment where I went, I've had an entire plane of dragons this whole time, and I forgot. Like, stuff like that will happen.
In fairness, you're not the only creator who forgets certain world building things. I'm looking at you, Akira Toriyama. May you rest in peace, but you did forget a lot of stuff.
I literally mentioned this to one of my other DM friends, and they're like, I have one of those, and I forgot about it too. Like, it was, but
I'm sorry, really quick. I'm just imagining an actual, like, airplane full of dragons just sitting on the tarmac, like, are we taking off soon? For the love of God!
But yeah,
It's like,
like,
oh,
There
they're
better be
still out there.
complimentary peanuts. I want to roast
Yeah.
the complimentary peanuts.
but yeah, like you can fine tune the world as much as you want. Get in there. You'll get you so much better building from the inside than you will from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Ian, what are your thoughts?
I think it's pretty similar, right? So I think as long as you have an idea that fits within that world, go for it. Because to that point, you're going to start to, as you walk through it, you're going to start to discover more, right? So it's almost like it's like a procedurally generated world, right? So for one of those, if you're playing a video game, as you go through it, you're going to have to create pieces of where do they go? What does this look like? If I'm having them go to downtown, what does their downtown look like? What does, if they're going to meet a new species or new culture, what does that culture look like? And so without that, you're not going to know that you need those pieces if you don't know that they even exist, right? Are there mountains in this world? If so, who lives there? What does it look like? How's it going to function? Ben and I have a story that we've been working on that we're hoping to get some chapters, issues, however you want to phrase it, out this year. And we spent a lot of time. It's set in in current day, but we spent a lot of time saying like, what part of the country is this in? And we had to go back and forth of like, well, if we start writing it out this way, what do we gain from it being here? And we play for a little bit and be like, okay, is it going to be Southwest? Is it going to be, the East Coast? And ultimately we had one character where it drove us to say, this needs to be in the Pacific Northwest because of something that they do frequently, that it just fits there. It just has to be. And that's something that gave us an idea of, okay, what does it mean for our culture in the area? What does it mean for our societal makeup in that area and whatnot? So how do things function, and what does that mean for this kind of town? And we started branching from there, and it gave us sort of the history of what would that town look like, why is it in the shape it's currently in, and what does that mean for it. So but again, we had to start playing with it and see what did we break when we started fleshing out with certain things, and do we need to add additional changes to it. So
yeah, totally get that. For me, the time did like kind of like pause world building, because in my opinion, world building never stops. While you're working on the draft of a thing, you are constantly world building. But for me, the moment that I actually start putting pen to paper and writing down the story that is taking place within that world is actually pertaining to the characters. It's when I feel like I have the characters kind of 70 to 80% figured out, and I want to explore how they would react when put into this world. And there's actually a lot that can actually come out during the drafting process for both the characters and the world. Like, for example, I did a graphic novella called Thoughtful Dinosaur. It's about a dinosaur who graduates from college and learns how to adult in a town called Fantasyville. And I did not know that the main character had any kind of theater background until she met up with an old friend. And then at that point in the script, I was like, well, the friend that she's met, Timmy the T-Rex, is having a problem because he's volunteering with a local theater, and their theater production just lost their lead. And then that is when Billy in the script was like, oh, I can do that part. That's no problem. Which led to the line that was like, oh yeah, you were in this one play in college, and so you have a bit of a theater background. And I'm like, well, that did not come up in the initial world building when I was like writing that kind of outline for this story. It just kind of came up organically as the story was being written. And so in like that second half of the story, there's a lot of like very subtle musical theater references. Like when Billy and Timmy are having their back and forth, it's like, oh, we're going to do this thing. Isn't that amazing? Fantastic. Which is a reference to a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Because there's a segment where two characters are talking with each other and they keep going, isn't that amazing? Fantastic. So musical theater got in there in Thoughtful Dinosaur. Also, was not expecting this for the Legend of Jamie Roberts. Pie is becoming a thing in the world building. Like it's like, oh yeah, what's the mischief that Jamie and friends would be doing when they were kids? Stealing pies. And there's also like a spin-off short story, The Legend of Azumi, which is about a baker who feeds a pie to an evil spirit. And I'm currently writing the actual like script for chapter 12. I have the story outlined, but I'm actually fleshing out chapter 12, and there's references to pie. And it's like, that would not have come out unless I actually started actively moving around in the world. So now it's like, well, now I have to know how people make pies in this universe. Like, what does that look like? Yeah. So among other questions that I wanted to ask about world building, this is actually kind of an interesting one, I think. Which comes first, the characters or the world? Or do they both pop up at the same time?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends. What do you have? Do you have a world that needs characters? Do you have characters that need a world?
Yeah.
I think wherever you can start your story is where you start. Like I said, I've started on opposite ends of the spectrum of like, I have no idea where these characters are at. But I know I just been the one I just finished it with where it's taking place at the end of the world. I didn't know what the cataclysm was, but I knew that the characters had to have something where the world was ending in like 94 minutes. And so I eventually fleshed out from there. But I was like, but that's just where I want to start the setting is this. So I was like, well, what does that mean then?
Right.
And then the ones you have the idea and you're like, I need characters to populate this society I'm creating, and what do I do with it now? So
Here's a question for you.
Okay.
There's a story you and I worked on a little while ago, No Man's Land. Because you created that setting, what was the start for you?
So, all right. What's the next anthology you're doing? Or that we're doing?
That's right. That's how it happened. I know this
So
already.
there were two topics that were going to come out for the last one, which was robots or gnomes. And I said, well, I'm not choosing. And so I decided to create, it was like, what about, like, it was two things you don't normally see together. And I was like, well, that just sounds fun. So
yeah.
In what instance would you see gnomes and
robots.
robots together? And I thought, well, what if they were like bitter enemies and fighting to the end? And then, eventually I just started fleshing out from there. I was like, well, that doesn't work. That's not fun for me to write. And so I knew that gnomes and robots, how they interact. I didn't want them to be like gnome-sized robots. I wanted them to be, human-sized robots. And so going from there, right, was that the world that they existed within came out of, well, what did I want to start telling the story from? So I kind of built them parallel. And every time that I needed something to shift, I was like, well, then just scrap that part of the world that doesn't work anymore and shift in something new.
But like that initial gnomes versus robot element, like the concept came before you came up with the story of what was going on with this particular gnome who was a scavenger.
I really want to tell a dinosaurs in space story. I don't know what it's going to do, but I really want to tell it. I want dinosaurs in a spaceship. I don't know what to do with it, but it's happening at some point. So,
I mean, we don't know what the next anthology is going to be. You just gave a very good idea.
I mean, I'm always down for dinosaurs. I was just talking about a comic called Thoughtful Dinosaur. So, yeah.
I don't know if Kelci likes dinosaurs. Even
I mean, it's not like I have dinosaurs like decorating my office space or anything. Yeah. But
also, Ian, remind me later. I need to show you Dinosaur Laser Fight by NSP.
Yes. That's a fun music video.
Yeah. But yeah, it's I really feel like usually when I'm creating a world, it's by accident. Okay. Like I'll start coming up with ideas and they'll just cascade from there. So sometimes I come up with the character first, sometimes I come up with the world first. Usually I come up with a concept first.
Sure.
That like it's always the concept that ends up happening. Like when I did horror comics a lot, that would always be the thing. I'd get like one image in my head and be like, I should build a comic around this concept. I did actually the really funny one for me there is very often when I was watching horror movies, I'd come up with completely different stories just from different things. Like there's a shot from the original Suspiria that inspired my story, Light Outside the Window, which is all about a ghost haunting a window in a dorm. And it has nothing to do with Suspiria. I was watching and was like, I have this idea now and I have to make a comic around this idea.
As you do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For me, it's actually often the characters that come first. And then the world pops up around it. And the world and its rules can change depending on what it is that I want the characters to achieve or the limitations that I want to place on the characters. And I also wanted to ask this question because I know one of the major stumbling blocks for young creatives in particular is they will draw characters in their sketchbook, but not have a story for them or a world to put them in yet. So, one thing that I found helpful is actually when drawing a character, looking at the props that they have and asking, well, why do they have that? So like an example is in the sci-fi book that I brought up, there was a character that I created who she had this like jerry-rigged looking laser pistol on her hip. And I was like, why does she have that? And it's like, oh, she built that herself. Oh, if she built that herself, how does she have access to a lab to build that? And so that led to other world building questions, which led to like the world and the rules that she operated in. Right. And that sort of thing also helped with figuring out where the heck to put Jamie and Friends, because initially Jamie and Friends were made for a completely different story. And then I was building the world of the legend of Jamie Roberts. And I went, well, wait, what if I just take Jamie Roberts and some of their friends and just right there and rocket it off from there? I think it's working out really well and in interesting ways. But yeah, it's often for me, it's the characters first. But it's also, you know, young people also tend to just draw characters in their sketchbooks and they're like, I'm just going to draw this really cool guy with really cool hair. I don't know what he's going to do yet. And you know, that's fine. You don't have to know right away. But as soon as you start drawing them with like props or certain costume details and you're like, yes, this clicks, start building off of that, I think.
I like the way you say that, and it's almost to your point of you have to start with the character sometimes is once you have your, like, we're all a product of the world around us, right? We are a product of how we grew up and what we've experienced. And so there is this give and take of, okay, if this is the world I'm in, then characters are going to have these kinds of pieces. Well, if I can't have my characters having that kind of background, well, then what do I have to shape from it? Like I come from a mixed race family, and we had conversations about one of our characters coming from a mixed race family, and we've decided, well, what does that mean then for what kind of things would have gone through? And literally where they grow up in the country is going to shape what is that experience like to some degree, right? Of what have they experienced in that time, and the demographics of the area and the city and things like that, and how does that shape them, right? And all kinds of pieces for that, especially when you get into those kinds of pieces, right? For a character's history, and it just changes is if this is, let's say, grounded in reality, is that, you know, obviously it's the thing they have to grapple with. If it's grounded in some other setting, maybe it's, you know, high fantasy, and that's not even a thing that comes up at all. Maybe that's it, you know, instead it is a you know, everyone's perfectly fine on that kind of piece of your background, but if you are, it's based on cities alone, right? And that's the thing. So it truly depends on what do you have to shape around them to make them into that person.
Right.
So it almost grows outward sometimes.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up the mixed race idea. The first thought that I thought of was, because growing up mixed race in middle of nowhere, Ohio is a very different experience from being mixed race in Washington, D.C., for example. But I had another thought about like how environment. Oh, there was a novel that I read. I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but it's about a small town in the South where it's almost all exclusively mixed race people. So it's like, okay, so if this town is made entirely of mixed race people, where's the strife coming from? And it turns out the strife is coming from colorism. And whether you can pass for white and how easily you can do so, and how that looks whenever you go outside of the town, and that sort of thing. So that's also an interesting world building prompt. And that particular novel, if I can remember it, I'll leave a comment on this replay when it posts. But that particular novel was set in a more like kind of like a realistic alternate telling of the 1960s going up and through the AIDS crisis. As far as like the timeline goes, it follows the lives of these two twins who grew up in this mixed race town, and then they end up splitting. One goes basically passing for white, and the other one ends up in the Black communities, and how their worlds diverge.
Are you talking about Passing by Nella Larson by any chance?
By what was the author again?
Nella Larson.
That does not sound like the author. It was like Bria something, I think.
Gotcha. Nella Larson wrote a book with a very similar concept called Passing.
Gotcha.
Very good, by the way. Highly recommended.
Gotcha. Yeah. But that in itself is interesting world building, to be like, what if there was this mixed race town? What would that look like if these twin girls moved out and they like diverged and went on separate paths? Like, that is also interesting world building in a way. Yeah. So yes.
Taking a slightly different tilt with that, going into gender politics a little, in Legend of Jamie Roberts, one of the big things Jamie comes across is he meets a culture that actually they meet a culture that has a concept for gender fluidity that's different from
the culture that they grew up in. The concept of the duenda, which is
that's what it was.
The duenda, which is it's a word that I made up, but it's kind of a play off of Navajo and Yoruba language. I kind of like I don't want to say borrowed the structure of both languages for that, but it's like I wanted to capture like the vibe of what it would sound like to speak those languages, and duenda was a good substitute for that. But duenda is the concept of that third gender, where it's like you're not a man or a woman, you have aspects of both, but you are neither. And the society has the window and the concept for that. And that also plugs into the overarching kind of, I'm trying to think of the right word for this, but they have this concept called the way, which is where all spirits come from and reside. And that's actually a play off of something that I wrote my entire thesis about, which was the afterlife of Dogon society. So I plugged in a little bit of world building in that way, but I'm trying not to go too far off the rails here because I could talk about this for days. But
this is the other danger of world building is once we get into it, we just want to talk about it.
Yeah, and I could gush about the world building that I put into this story for like if you don't stop me, I will not stop. But I'm gonna put the brakes there and be like, yes, I wanted to incorporate that concept of the third gender. Not necessarily as like, oh, this is going to play an important point in the plot, but as like this is going to make the world a richer experience, and it's going to put a word to an experience that Jamie had that they previously did not have words for before. And that to me was super important that I put that in the story.
And that's kind of the concept I was getting at. You have a really cool element where, especially when you have multiple cultures you build into a world, where you can have people discovering completely new ways of thinking or new cultures, and you can actually kind of, that's a place you can take your characters and you can have them experience new stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love having that in my comic. Yes.
I have a question for you too, based on something you just said then, which is, and it's more my brain went in a different direction than where you went with it, but it's, I'm curious as to your thoughts on it. So you said, you could talk for days on that. when you're world building, it is really easy to get stuck in the weeds and over engineer.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do when you find yourselves over engineering a world and saying, like, I have built all of this out, most of this is not useful, and I need to rein it back in and undo some of the restrictions I have given myself? Or do you find it difficult to abandon those ideas, or is it more of like a, hey, it's no longer useful, kill it?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm going to need a second to articulate my thoughts on this. So, Ben, if you want to go first, go for it.
Well, what's tough for me is I don't think I do kill it. I think I'm like, okay, these ideas exist in the world, even if they never come up.
Fair enough.
And it's why I make D&D campaigns, because sometimes there's a draconic plane and it never comes up in the story, but you know it's out there.
Those dragons are still waiting on the tarmac.
They're still waiting on the tarmac. They're getting
we'll be taking off any moment here in just a few more minutes.
There is a Karen dragon in the corner. It is a green dragon.
So, Ben, the thing I'm thinking of is when you and I talked 38 originally, we had an idea of sets of how powers played out, without getting the weeds on this, but primary, secondary, tertiary, and all this piece. And eventually we realized this was overly complicated and no longer served the story.
Okay,
and I remember being sad cutting that piece, because it gave us really rich explanation and literal web of how the characters interacted with each other and all this that was critical at the time. And eventually I had to say, this is no longer serving the story. This is no longer part of this world and this lore, because it doesn't help me anymore. But I remember I had put hours into this, and eventually I was like, I have to cut it, or I'm gonna kill the story.
Okay, so that's different than what I understood from your question, because what you're talking about is when you're creating the rules for a world very specifically.
Yeah.
And the thing there is, it is so easy for rules to get way overblown and complicated. Just look at any legal system in the world.
Yes.
It is so easy to start simple and make things more and more complicated and think of more examples and get more and more complex.
Yeah.
And what happens almost every single time, for me anyway, is you get to a certain point and then you'll realize, wait, would this all work if I did this one thing that made everything easier, and it'll just happen?
Yeah.
That happens all the time. And that's what happened with 38.
Oh, yeah.
That's on that project. We kind of realized this is getting really complicated. Is it simpler if we just do this and it still does exactly what we want to do, but better? And that's what we went with. And yeah, it sucks. You got to throw out all the extra work, but that was the scaffolding you had to build around the actual thing you were making.
Somewhere those spreadsheets still exist, somewhere in my files.
Yeah. It's funny that you talk about like bloated rules and politics, because it made me think that part of the reason that the Roman Empire, a lot of Chinese dynasties, and a lot of African empires fell was not too much because of outside forces, but because of bureaucratic bloat.
Yeah.
So that might be worth exploring in a world. If you're building a world and you want to see an empire fall, maybe look at, hey, how can the rules get really bloated, and go off from there.
I'll bring up yet another D&D example. One of the things that I've said for a long time in one of my settings is that magic now works differently than it used to work, and I never explained it. I was like, it was different. And then more recently, because elements of it started coming up in the story, I had to sit down and think about it. And I came up with a very simple, straightforward answer for why old magic was way more dangerous, way more chaotic, and just absolutely insane.
Yeah.
But it doesn't break the universe that I'd already set up. It just meant, I have a practically one word answer for what this magic was. And that makes everything work.
Yeah.
And I would tell you, except Ian's going to be in a campaign in this setting pretty soon. And
I'll just cover my ears.
No knowledge.
Cover your ears, and then you just cover the headphones.
Cover my ears.
Push the
headphones closer. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just to repeat the question so that I know what I'm answering. Ian, you were asking, like,
if you over-engineer it, do you find it difficult to cut back and prune your world to fit the story you want to tell? Like, do you find you have missed the pieces you've cut down, and do you ever repurpose those into a new world?
I mean, that's part of why I have a few spin-off stories in the Legend of Jamie
Fair enough.
Roberts universe.
Fair enough.
So I mean, with that kind of world building, if I feel like there's a ton of it, but it doesn't fit in the mainline story, I'll make a spin-off story and have it be a little one shot or something like that. Sometimes some world building pieces do get worked into other future stories. Like there was some world building that I did for Thoughtful Dinosaur and Johnson and Sir that I was like, well, this doesn't fit in either story. So I spun it off into a different one, which is still a work in progress. It's not out yet. Hopefully it'll be out before the end of the year, but we'll see. But yeah, it's part of why I do a spin-off mini comics and little spin-off short stories, is that there is some world building that I was like, oh, this is really cool. I can't put it in the main story, so I'll put it in this one.
Yeah.
I feel like my big problem though is that sometimes I feel like I jump into a world, but I haven't done enough building. And that tends to be the problem that I have to work around. And it's almost like I am building the world as I am working on the first draft in particular, which is fine. The first draft is the draft of the story that you tell yourself. You're not really supposed to share the first draft with anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to throw it out there real quick, we've been going for about 50 minutes. If anyone in chat has questions, we will see them. So go ahead and post them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you're catching this on the replay, because there were a couple of folks who I posted about this on Discord and they were like, I can't make it for the live version. Is this going to be available as a replay? And I was like, yes. So if you're catching this on the replay version, feel free to leave a comment below and we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can, because we see the comments. Yeah. So any final thoughts that either of you would like to share about world building in comics?
You mentioned young creators and often drawing things out and not knowing where to place those things yet. I find, I mean, obviously as a writer, I'm always looking for an artist when I create a comic or things like that, right? And I'm a big fan of collaboration. And I would say, if you have pieces you have not fleshed out yet, talking to someone else whose opinion you trust can be huge.
Absolutely.
There's a story I'm working on now where I brought it to Ben. He's like, yeah, none of that works from a functional standpoint. You have to find reasons that these things, he's like, that ship can't work. And I'm like, that's not going to float. That's not going to work.
Yeah.
He's like, it's going to be fine. And so I started redesigning it and he's like, that might work. Okay.
I should also point out that that's another place where you can absolutely get stuck in the weeds. This is a good example of getting stuck in the weeds.
Yeah.
This was specifically like a pirate style galleon type ship, but with other requirements that are going to need to be in there. And I'd literally been studying these ships recently for another project. So the things Ian was pitching, just my brain started going, no, you can't. It doesn't work that way.
We're going to do it. It's going to happen.
I'll tell you another
like
fun version of this. I got on a big kick of map designing, and that got wild because at one point it's like, oh yeah, you can just draw the map for this world and, just do a squiggly line. It'll be fine. And then you start going down rabbit holes of, okay, what would the prevailing winds be? Like, what would the tides be like? Where would the mountain ranges be? I want this to be scientifically accurate.
We haven't seen when you get weeks.
When you get, I look full Charlie Day. Like, you really can get hung up on some of that stuff. And I think part of the trick also is you got to be careful and look for when it stops being fun.
Yes.
Because that's not going to ruin your world building. You might get stuck on it for a little bit and then get through it. And honestly, can make things better. I like that setting I mentioned that I've had since college. Yeah. I made a map for it recently for the first time. And I didn't know the name of the continent they were on until I did that. Like, that was a big moment. And now I know what all the continents on this world are like. I know how many there are. I know how all this stuff kind of works. And I got to fill that in because I finally took the time to stop and draw that. And that was like 10 years in, I did this.
Yeah.
So
I want to see that map now. 'Cause I
Yeah,
know this
same.
story.
Yeah.
Chandu actually brought up a interesting point in the comment section, which was supposedly Ursula K. Le Guin always began with the map. And I want to add to this, which is that hilariously, in The Legend of Jamie Roberts and in another like fantasy novel that I wrote for a National Novel Writing Month challenge, in both of those stories, I began with a blank map, and the characters are fleshing it out as they explore.
That's cool.
And starting with a map is a great way to come up with a lot of this stuff also. First time I drew a map was specifically, well, first off, I wanted to figure out how making a map works. And this is where I discovered I need to be very careful thinking about topography because it drives me crazy. But it was one of the things that I started coming up with was like, okay, there are these two islands near, like in one section on this big lake. I'm gonna put a city on each island and they don't like each other. And like you start coming up with things like that. Like you figure out where the trade routes would be, and like there would need to be outposts here because there would be converging things. And like this river would be in a lot of fertile land. They can really come up with some great story designs from a map if that's how you decide to start.
Yeah.
Just don't think too much about physics if you don't want to go crazy. Think a little bit about physics. Like it's nice to come up with that. I have a friend who literally
physics.
Here's the thing. I have a friend who has literally created the tectonic history of one of their settings going back billions of years. They have a program that shows them how the continents moved around.
That's some next level. Wow.
Yeah, they did
I
it
feel
because it was
ashamed
fun.
now for doing nothing close to
Don't do not. That's a whole level of
challenge accepted.
That is that person's fixation.
I will say this. I'm not calling them out in chat. You both know them. Anyway.
I have ideas now.
Yeah.
I think I know who it is.
Moving away from this just for one moment, because we mentioned final thoughts before.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to bring up, because it has been mentioned a few times with, especially with new writers or new cartoonists doing stuff. The single best thing you can do with any of your worlds or any of your settings is start telling stories in them.
Yes.
It feels like it's not ready. It's not going to be ready till you start doing that. Like that is it. You are going to start. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be exactly what you want it to be, but you will learn from everything you do, and it's going to get better and it's going to improve. Like it's the classic example of, I mean, picture a baby learning how to talk. They don't learn how to talk by staying silent.
Yeah.
They learn how to talk by saying nonsense syllables until they figure out how to form the correct syllables.
Yep. It's actually interesting that you brought that up, because I have been reading kind of slowly because I need to actually make time to read. But I've been reading Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. He's one of the leads at Pixar. And he talks a bit about the creative process. Now, the thing about this book is that it's a lot more about like managing creative teams. But he does talk about the creative process of making a film from like the germination phase to the finished product. And he calls the movies when they're first being formed ugly babies. And it is your job to protect the ugly baby and make sure that it can grow into its final form, basically. Because because when you first start out, and he fully admits this, like it could be really easy to believe that like Pixar movies just start out amazing from the get-go. They do not.
No.
They definitely do not. They go through multiple rounds of working with a creative team that they call the Brain Trust, which is a collection of directors who listen to the pitch and then they give feedback on the pitch, which that would be one tip from me. Final thought: get yourself a creative team so that if you're stuck on a world building idea, you can reach out to your creative team and be like, what do? And they can give you feedback on it. Highly important for Pixar. It is highly important for you. Yes. I had another thought, but I'll put a pin in that for now. Ian, do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'd piggyback on that of lean on others if you're struggling. Like I said, I'll always say I'm a big fan of collaboration. I think it makes us stronger when we allow others to play in the space that we've created and find areas we haven't yet explored, or point out potential pitfalls in the road ahead of us. And so I think that it's important to always do that. And if you're really struggling and you have a world you want to do something with and you don't know what to do with it, maybe somebody else does, right? And maybe you're happy to say, I have these characters, I don't know what to do with them, but aren't they cool? Somebody else may say, I love those characters, let's go do this with them. So I got involved in a project last year with that, where the person's like, I have characters, I don't know what to do with them. I was like, I have ideas. They're like, great, let's do it. So I mean, that happens, and I think it's, as long as you're creating something that you're happy to be creating, great, right? And whatever that means. So
yeah, absolutely. The thought is lost entirely.
Okay, fair enough.
And then it left. Yeah.
But yeah, with it's funny because collaboration is another thing we should have. We done a stream about collaboration? Because it seems like that'd be a cool idea.
Yes, there is a video about collaborating in teams, and that's something that is on our channel. You can check that out. Link below. Self-plug.
Yep. I'll make the banner pop up again. There you go.
There you go. Thank you.
But yeah, it is definitely useful to be able to work with other people and get other perspectives. It was one of the funny things when because one of the things I do is help organize anthologies. Just seeing how amazing it was getting a bunch of creators together with ideas and putting together a bunch of stories really quickly, getting a book out. Working with other people can be absolutely great. And I know a lot of cartoonists who don't do it. I didn't do it for a long time. I really, because there are all these stories, and part of why I became a cartoonist is I was like, I want to be able to do everything myself because I don't trust anybody else to get it right exactly the way I see it. And then I started collaborating, and I was like, wow, it's really cool having someone else think for me a little bit. Like, that takes so much of the load off. It's great. I still have to think about some of the other stuff, but I still do solo projects, but being able to collaborate is really nice and something I highly encourage, especially if you're still figuring out world building, because someone else will ask questions you didn't think about. Like going back to the world with the ship that Ian mentioned. One of the other things, do you mind if I talk about the continent thing?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So he had this concept.
All trademarks now officially, though.
Yes, patent pending. But one of the concepts that Ian had was he had an idea for a world where the continents are completely like circumnavigating the world and are like
basically rings around the world.
Yeah, so rings around the world and continent, ocean, continent, ocean, continent, ocean.
Ooh.
And my first thought was that could never work. That's crazy. And then I started actually getting into my head like, well, I could actually picture like if there was an impact or something like that caused while the planet was young, and it caused like this ripple effect from that. And I started going through it in my head. I'm like, you could do some really cool world building stuff built around this one concept.
Are you sure you're not the tectonic plates person? Because it sounds like you just wanted the history of the world.
Here's the thing. I'm friends with the tectonic plates person, and I envy them.
Oh, so you're the enabler.
I'm the enabler. No, we see this stuff and we're like, that's really cool. That same group is why I was figuring out all the weather stuff, because it came up in our setting because one of our people is an environmental scientist. And it was like, oh yeah, like that makes perfect sense, because in this area there'd be a rain shadow, so there'd be a lot of rain on this section of the mountains, and like then there's all this other stuff. And as they talk about it, I'm just like, well, now I'm going to think about this every time I make a map.
Yeah.
And then you go down YouTube rabbit holes of, oh, by the way, this is how you can make the stuff more realistic. Here's real weather patterns, and I'm like, you're killing me.
I do remember the point now. The train came back.
Yay!
The train of thought came back, and it docked into the station. As far as other resources for world building goes, I actually want to give a shout out to a YouTube channel that I've been watching for ages now. They're called Hello Future Me. his name's Tim. He's actually written 2 books on the subject. On world building, volumes 1 and 2. While I haven't read the books, I have found his YouTube videos about world building to be exceptionally useful and really good jumping off points to ask questions to help you flesh out your world. So highly recommend that you check out Hello Future Me in particular. If you really want to like look at existing things and ask questions to be like, well, what if this? Trope Talks from Overly Sarcastic Productions is also a really good jumping off point for ideas for that sort of thing. So I just wanted to give those shout outs, but in particular, Hello Future Me, because he is very specifically all about building worlds. That is his thing. So yeah, that's what I wanted to shout out. With that, we've been going for about an hour and 5 minutes. Think it might be a good time to start doing like final announcements, final like wrapping it up.
Works for me.
Cool.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in for this live. If you're catching this on the replay, thank you for tuning in for the replay. Here's the segment where Ben and I can at least plug some stuff for the Columbus Cartoon Coalition and our own work. So if you would like to find out more about the Columbus Cartoon Coalition, we are a collective of Columbus area creatives, as well as the surrounding Ohio region, because I'm based out of Toledo. But I'm basically an honorary Columbus citizen at this point.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I'm an honorary citizen. But
we claim you for tax purposes.
Yes, exactly. The Ritter. No. But yes, if you want to find out more about the Columbus Cartoon Coalition, we have this here YouTube channel. You can subscribe and hit the notification bell for the next topic that we'll be covering, because we're doing these kinds of videos in collaboration with the Global Comic Project, which aims to help bring creative tools for making comics and worlds to other creatives around the world. And the Columbus Cartoon Coalition also has an Instagram page. We also have like in-person meetups every once in a while, and we work together to make our comic projects even better. So you can find out more about us through the links in the description and by checking out our Instagram page. And we also have a Discord server. The Discord server is very active.
It's a fantastic group of people. There really is. It's a lot of talent. It's a lot.
One very good.
Thank you.
One very good way to track them down if you're in the Columbus area. Space is coming up, April 27th and 28th, and the Columbus Cartoon Coalition does have a table right up front next to the back porch comics table. So the people who are actually running Space, next to that is going to be the C3 table. So definitely come and check that out. I will also be in attendance with Ian, actually. Ian's going to be joining at my table.
Yes.
Yes. And Kelci will be there in spirit.
I will be there in spirit. I will not be there physically, but I will be there in spirit.
We'll FaceTime with you and just hold you up at the table.
Hi, welcome to the C3 table. Check out our stuff. Exactly.
That should be really fun. Anyway.
I mean, I wouldn't be opposed. I don't think I have
a cast of faces coming through from everybody.
Pretty much.
Yeah. But yeah, if you would like to find out more about Columbus Cartoon Coalition, check us out at Space or check out the links in the description. If you would like to find my stuff, including The Legend of Jamie Roberts, that webcomic is actually available to read for free online at thelegendofjamieroberts.com. And you can find everything else that I do online at kelcidcrawford.com. That's Kelci with a C-I, dcrawford.com. I'm also on YouTube at Kelci D Comics. Links for those are going to be down in the description. Ben, give yourself a shout out, because the links that I have are actually for JM, because I had not updated the description in time. So
yep. Well, speaking of in time, I managed to find your link finally. There you go.
Thank you.
But yeah, you can find my work at bwhcomics.com. I'm also at bwhcomics on Patreon, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. You can also find my Weeb comic Cospain a weeb comic about cosplay and convention craziness over at cospaynecomic.com. I'm also doing a special shout out right now for my Twitch channel, which I'm now realizing I don't think I have a link preset up for, but that's okay. It's twitch.tv/BWHcomics. I stream every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern with video game streams, and I'm starting to do more art streams during the day. I'm hoping to do one this Friday, so please give it a follow and check it out. Trying to get the numbers up, so I'm going to be a lot more active.
Heck yeah. Ian, where can people find you, online or off?
Offline, you'll find me in the Canon Right anthologies. Somewhat, you'll see some of my stuff through Columbus Cartoon Coalition. Some of the things that are posted, and then I'll start actually putting things online soon. It's one of those like I want to do it, or I could keep creating things, and so I tend to not focus on the actual business side of things as much as I should. So
no worries, no pressure. But hey, we'll be happy to see you in space.
I'll be there.
Space. The Small Press Alternative Comics Expo. But also in space.
In space.
Hold on, I need to say it properly, like Tim Curry. Space.
It's one of those things. It's always a pet peeve for me when people say the first blank in space, and I'm always like, we're all in space. Everything is in space.
Everything.
I mean, sure, if you want to get technical.
Say outer space. Anyway. All right.
Yes. All right. So that is all for now. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. You are awesome.
Rock on, guys, and never stop drawing.
Thanks, everybody.